The cultural context theory was introduced by anthropologist Edward T. Hall in 1976. This theory helps us understand how much of an impact culture has on communication and our styles of communicating. Hall split this theory into two different contexts. So you have high context cultures and low context cultures. High context cultures include the Middle East, Asia, Africa, and South America. These cultures tend to be more close knit, use more interpersonal communication, use more hand gestures. They put a lot of emphasis on learning through practice and observation rather than just taking notes and listening to someone. Then you have your low context cultures, which include North America and a great part of Western Europe. Low context cultures value roles and they are very task oriented. Low context culture put a high emphasis on roles and they're very task centered. It is important to know that throughout the years, culture can change. Culture doesn't always stay the same. So the people within that culture have to adapt to different cultures or to the different ways of the cultures. Cultures change over a period of time. They never really stay the same. So, for example, with our culture today, we use a lot of technology versus back in the day, everybody didn't have smartphones. So people really have to flow with the differences. And that can also be another thing that hinders communication between cultures. So people really have to learn how to adapt and put the differences aside. There's always going to be differences. No culture is the exact same. So people just have to get past the differences and learn how to respect the differences in order to move forward in the communication process. A lot of miscommunication can be avoided that way if people just not ignore the differences, but if they respect the differences and know the differences. It's important for people to get to know about other cultures because that's going to greatly help communication and make a more well-rounded person when they try to communicate. Okay, so now that you all are a little bit aware of the differences between high and low context cultures, let's talk about one thing that stood out to me. While doing my research, I realized that high context cultures tend to be more silent. So, high context cultures value silence because, as you remember in my discussion a little bit earlier, we talked about how high context cultures use a lot of nonverbal communication, a lot of hand gestures, their tone of voice. They go off of things like that. So silence is very respected. In high context cultures, silence represents mutual understanding. So when you're having dialect with someone and there's silence, that equals understanding to them. Now, if you go back to the low context cultures, which is like Americans basically, we don't like silence. We tend to have more dialect, conversation. Those things are important to us. Communication verbally is understanding. Like if we were just to have a conversation with someone and then stop talking, that person's going to be like, okay, well, what's going on? That is not mutual understanding in our eyes. So silence in low context cultures is perceived negatively, which brings me back to another thing that stuck with me when I did my research paper. Conflict. Conflict is very negative in low context cultures, we try to stay away from conflict. Nobody really likes conflict. But in high context cultures, conflict is value. Conflict, it helps the communication process and is highly encouraged. So you can really start to see those differences as you really get deeper into the cultural context theories. It's things like this that we have to understand to communicate with another culture. These things are extremely important. Okay, now I would like to get on the topic of individualism and collectivism. These things tie in with the cultural context theory, but they're more geared towards cross-cultural communication, which also goes into the cultural context theory because, it's all about communication at the end of the day. How are you communicating with other people from different cultural backgrounds? So with the individualism, obviously this means that a person cares more about themselves and their family. And I'm not talking about like distant cousins. I'm talking about like husband, wife, child, mother, things like that. And collectivism, it's more about the community as a whole. People care about everyone. Like, it's not just about that person. So with that being said, would you guys perceive high context cultures to fall under collectivism or individualism? And then vice versa for low context cultures. So I would like you guys to respond with that answer.